I knew the moment he pulled over that he wasn't there to fix my car, but because he saw a target that couldn't run and he wanted to see how long it would take for the fear to set in. My sedan had died on a stretch of the Bonneville Salt Flats where the horizon is nothing but a flat, white line that disappears into a bruised purple sky. There was no cell service, no wind, and for 40 miles in every direction, there was absolutely nothing but the smell of ancient salt and the heat radiating off my dead engine. When the headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, they didn't look like a savior's lights. They looked like two predatory eyes cutting through the haze of the desert night. He didn't rush to get out of his truck, but instead, he sat there for a full 3 minutes with his high beams blinding me, forcing me to shield my eyes while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the crusty earth, and tried to put on a brave face even though my hands were shaking so hard I had to shove them into my pockets. The man finally opened his door, and the interior light of his rusted tow truck revealed a cabin cluttered with heavy chains, stained rags, and a series of rusted tools that didn't look like they belonged to a professional mechanic. He was tall, thin, and moved with a slow, deliberate confidence that told me he had done this many times before on this very road. He didn't ask what was wrong with my car, but instead, he stood just outside the reach of my own dimming interior light and asked me how far I was traveling alone. It was a question that didn't need an answer, because we both knew that in the middle of this desolate wasteland, nobody was coming to check on me for at least another 12 hours. The silence between us was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my cooling engine and the distant, lonely howl of a coyote that sounded far too close for comfort. He started walking around my car, his eyes never leaving mine, and he began to whistle a low, off-key tune that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I asked him if he had a radio or a jump starter, but he just chuckled and told me that his equipment was back in the truck and that I should probably hop inside where it was warm. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go because the salt flats offered no cover and no hiding spots for miles. I wondered if he had a weapon, or if he planned to use the heavy steel chains hanging from the back of his rig to ensure I didn't get away. As he moved closer, I noticed that the license plate on his truck was covered in thick, dried mud, despite the fact that it hadn't rained in this part of the state for nearly 3 months. I realized then that he wasn't a local mechanic, but someone who spent his nights cruising these empty veins of highway looking for people who had nowhere to turn. He reached out a hand, his fingers greasy and black with oil, and suggested that I hand over my keys so he could check the ignition for me. I gripped my keys tightly in my pocket, feeling the sharp metal edges dig into my palm, and I told him I'd rather wait for the morning light. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and vacant, and he told me that the desert gets very dangerous at night for people who don't know how to follow directions. He began to describe in vivid and terrifying detail what happens to the human body when it's left out in the heat for too long, and I realized he wasn't talking about the weather anymore. He was describing his intentions, painting a picture of my own disappearance while he slowly backed me up against the side of my dead vehicle. I looked toward his truck and noticed that the passenger side door didn't have a handle on the inside, which confirmed my worst fears about what happened to the people who actually agreed to get in. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast, because he was starting to lose his patience and his hand was drifting toward a long, heavy wrench tucked into his belt loop. My mind raced through the trunk of my car, trying to remember if I had anything I could use to defend myself against a man who was twice my size and clearly experienced in the art of intimidation. I remembered the small can of pressurized tire sealant I had bought a month ago, which was sitting right on the passenger seat behind the thin glass of the window. I reached behind me, pretending to lean against the car for support, and my fingers brushed the cold metal of the can through the open crack of the window. He saw my movement and stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure aggression as he realized I was no longer playing the role of the helpless victim. He lunged for my throat, but I spun away, the salt cracking under my feet as I scrambled toward the other side of the car to put the engine block between us. He let out a low growl of frustration and began to circle the vehicle again, but this time he wasn't whistling. He was breathing heavily, his boots thudding against the ground like a drumbeat of approaching doom. I managed to grab the can and the heavy flashlight from the seat, feeling a small surge of hope as the weight of the objects gave me a fighting chance. I knew I couldn't outrun his truck, and I couldn't hide in the flat landscape, so I had to make sure he couldn't follow me if I managed to disable his vehicle. The moon was high now, casting long, distorted shadows across the white salt, making it hard to tell where he was until I heard the metallic clink of his wrench hitting the roof of my car. He was trying to flush me out, playing a sadistic game of cat and mouse while the stars looked down with cold indifference to my struggle. I ducked low and crept toward the front of his truck, hoping the darkness and the glare of his own high beams would keep me hidden for just a few precious seconds. I reached the front of his rig and saw the heavy rubber hoses of his cooling system exposed near the grill, and I realized this was my only shot at stopping him. I used the sharp end of my car key to puncture the main hose, watching as the steaming green fluid began to spray out onto the white ground like a neon wound. He heard the hiss of the escaping pressure and let out a scream of rage, realizing that I had just sabotaged his only means of chasing me across the flats. I didn't wait to see his reaction, but instead, I sprinted toward the dark horizon, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with every frantic step I took. I ran for what felt like miles, never looking back, until the lights of his truck finally flickered and died in the distance as his engine seized up from the heat. I huddled behind a small outcropping of rocks as the sun began to peek over the edge of the world, turning the salt into a blinding field of gold and pink. I watched from my hiding spot as a highway patrol car finally appeared on the distant road, its siren silent but its presence feeling like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I flagged them down, my voice hoarse and my body trembling, and I told them about the man in the rusted tow truck who was still stranded out there in the white void. They found him 3 miles away, sitting on the hood of his dead truck with his wrench in his hand, waiting for the next person to break down so he could finish what he started. I survived that night on the salt flats, but I never drive through the middle of nowhere without a full tank of gas and a lock on every door. The hum of the wind turbines was the first thing that started to eat away at my sanity during those long, lonely night shifts in the heart of the Indiana Plains. I was a junior technician tasked with the midnight maintenance rotation, which meant spending 10 hours a day driving a dusty utility truck between massive steel towers that stretched up into the black sky like the ribs of a giant. There are over 500 turbines in that field, and when you are standing at the base of one, the nearest human being is often 10 miles away, tucked safely in a farmhouse with the doors locked and the lights out. It was a Tuesday night when I noticed the first hatch was unlocked, a heavy steel door at the base of turbine 412 that should have been sealed tight from the inside. I remember thinking it was just a lapse in protocol by the day shift, until I saw the fresh, muddy boot prints leading directly into the dark, hollow belly of the machine. I climbed the internal ladder, the sound of my own breathing echoing off the curved metal walls, and I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid about a simple mistake. The turbines are hollow, filled with electrical cabinets and the constant, vibrating thrum of the generator far above, creating a noise that masks the sound of anyone or anything moving in the shadows. When I reached the first platform, I noticed a small pile of discarded food wrappers and a sleeping bag tucked behind a high-voltage transformer, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized someone had been living inside the tower for weeks. It wasn't a technician, because there were no tools or safety logs, just the smell of stale sweat and the distinct, chilling sense that I was being watched from the darkness of the upper decks. I called out a greeting, my voice shaking and thin against the roar of the wind, but the only response was the slow, rhythmic creak of the massive blades spinning overhead. I decided to descend immediately and call the site manager, but as I reached for the ladder, I heard a metallic clack from below that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Someone had just engaged the manual deadbolt on the exterior hatch, locking me inside a windowless steel tube with no way out and no cell service through the thick industrial shielding. I stood on that narrow metal grate, looking down into the abyss of the tower floor, and realized that the squatter hadn't run away when they heard me coming. They had simply moved to the side, waited for me to climb past them, and then trapped me in their makeshift home like a moth in a jar. I began to shout, hammering my heavy flashlight against the steel walls, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the relentless thumping of the turbine blades and the whistling wind outside. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps on the ladder, slow and heavy, coming up from the bottom toward my position on the first platform. There was no way to go but up, so I began to climb as fast as my shaking limbs would allow, my hands slipping on the cold rungs as I ascended toward the nacelle at the very top. Every time I paused to catch my breath, I could hear the steady, purposeful clanging of metal on metal from below, letting me know that the intruder was gaining on me. I wondered who would choose to live out here in the middle of nowhere, and what kind of person would decide to hunt a stranger in the middle of the night instead of just slipping away into the darkness of the plains. The higher I climbed, the hotter the air became from the electrical components, and the more I felt like I was being herded into a trap with no secondary exit. I reached the top platform, nearly 300 feet above the ground, and I could feel the entire tower swaying slightly in the powerful gusts of the midnight wind. I looked down through the gaps in the floor plating and saw a shadowy figure standing just 2 levels below me, staring up with eyes that caught the faint glimmer of the status lights. He wasn't saying a word, which was the most terrifying part, because his silence told me that there was no room for negotiation or pleading for my life. I realized that he didn't want my truck or my money. He wanted the tower to remain his secret, and I was the only person who knew he was there. I reached into my tool belt and found a heavy industrial flare, the kind we use for emergency signaling during storms, and I felt a spark of desperate hope as I gripped the plastic casing. The man reached the final ladder and his hand appeared over the edge of the platform. A thick, calloused hand with dirt under the fingernails and a jagged scar across the knuckles. I didn't wait for him to pull himself up, but instead, I kicked the heavy metal hatch cover down with all the strength I had left, catching his fingers and sending him reeling back down to the level below. He let out a muffled cry of pain, the first sound he had made, and I used that brief moment of distraction to scramble toward the emergency descent cable located at the back of the nacelle. It was a terrifying risk, a high-speed rappel system designed only for life or death fires, but I knew it was my only chance to reach the ground before he recovered and came for me again. I hooked my harness to the line, took a deep breath of the freezing night air, and stepped off the platform into the empty blackness of the Indiana night. The descent was a blur of whistling wind and the smell of burning friction as the mechanical brakes struggled to slow my fall against the side of the massive white tower. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth and sending a shock of pain through my ankles, but I didn't stop to check for injuries. I sprinted toward my utility truck, my keys fumbling in my hand as I looked back at the turbine and saw the man already sliding down the internal ladder like a shadow through the steel. I threw the truck into gear just as he reached the hatch, his face finally visible in my reversing lights. A mask of pure, frantic desperation and misplaced territorial rage. I roared away from the sight, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel that obscured him in the rearview mirror until he was nothing more than a speck in the vast, empty landscape. I drove until I reached the main highway, my hands still locked onto the steering wheel with a white-knuckled grip that I couldn't seem to loosen. I met the county sheriff at a gas station 20 miles away, and when they returned to Turbine 412, they found the hatch standing wide open and the sleeping bag gone. They found evidence that he had been living there for months, surviving on stolen supplies from local farms and watching the technicians from the shadows of the upper decks. I never went back to that wind farm, and even now, when I see those giant white blades spinning on the horizon, I can't help but wonder how many other hollow towers are hiding someone who doesn't want to be found. I realized that the middle of nowhere isn't actually empty. It's just full of places where a person can disappear if they are willing to live in the dark. I recognized the mismatched headlight in my rearview mirror for the fourth time tonight, and this time, there was nowhere left to turn because the desert had swallowed the last of the streetlights and the gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to the empty line. I had been driving through the Mojave for nearly 6 hours, and the silver sedan with the flickering left lamp had been behind me since I crossed the state line, keeping a perfect, haunting distance that felt more like a leash than a coincidence. Every time I sped up to 80 miles per hour, the light stayed right there, and every time I slowed down to 50, hoping they would just pass me and be done with it, the light slowed down too. My heart was pounding against my ribs so hard it was making my vision blur, and the silence of the desert outside the window felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass. I saw a sign for an abandoned rest area coming up in 2 miles, a place that was nothing more than a concrete slab and a rusted picnic table. But I knew I couldn't keep driving on fumes while a predator watched the back of my head. I pulled into the rest stop, the gravel screaming under my tires as I skidded to a halt near a row of dead palm trees that looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the moon. I kept my engine running for a second, my hand hovering over the gear shift, hoping the silver sedan would just keep going and disappear into the black horizon. Instead, the mismatched headlights turned slowly into the entrance, the engine of the other car purring with a low, predatory growl that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. They didn't park right next to me, but instead, they pulled into a spot about 50 feet away, positioned perfectly so that their high beams were shining directly into my side mirror, blinding me and making it impossible to see who was behind the wheel. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead, and I realized that I was completely alone in a landscape that didn't care if I lived or died tonight. I reached into my glove box and grabbed the heavy iron tire iron I kept for emergencies, feeling the cold, solid weight of it in my palm as I tried to steady my breathing. Why wasn't he getting out of the car? And why was he just sitting there with the lights on, watching me like I was a bug trapped in a jar? I knew I couldn't stay in the car forever because the heat was rising and the air was getting stale, but the thought of stepping out into that open, empty space felt like a death sentence. I looked at my phone, but there were 0 bars of service, just a glowing screen that showed a no service message that felt like a final warning. I decided I had to make a move before he did, so I slowly opened my door, the hinge letting out a long metallic groan that sounded like a scream in the absolute stillness of the desert night. The moment my feet hit the dirt, the other car's engine shut off, and the silence that followed was so loud it made my ears ring. I stood there by my open door, my knuckles white as I gripped the tire iron, and I called out into the darkness, asking him what he wanted from me. There was no answer, just the sound of a distant wind whistling through the dry brush and the clicking of his cooling engine. Then, I heard the soft, unmistakable thud of a car door closing on his side, and the sound of boots hitting the gravel with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He wasn't rushing, and he wasn't sneaking. He was walking with the confidence of someone who knew there was nowhere for his prey to run. I started backing away toward the rear of my car, my eyes fixed on the silhouette that was slowly emerging from the glare of the silver sedan's headlights. He was a big man, wearing a heavy duster coat that seemed far too warm for the desert night, and he was carrying something long and thin in his right hand that didn't look like a tool. I asked him again what he wanted, my voice cracking with a fear that I couldn't hide anymore, and he finally spoke in a voice that was low and raspy, like sandpaper on wood. He told me that I had something of his, something I had picked up at the last gas station, and he wasn't going to leave until he had it back. I had no idea what he was talking about, as I had only bought a bottle of water and a bag of chips, but the look in his eyes told me that the truth didn't matter to him. He was using a lie to justify the hunt, a thin veil of an excuse to get close enough to finish the job he started 6 hours ago. I realized then that he was closing the gap, his strides getting longer and more aggressive, and I knew that if I stayed by the car, he would pin me against the metal and it would be over. I turned and bolted toward the abandoned restroom building, a crumbling concrete shack that sat at the edge of the property, hoping I could find a door that locked or a window I could climb through. The sound of his boots on the gravel behind me turned into a frantic run, and I could hear his heavy breathing getting closer and closer as I reached the door of the men's room. I slammed my shoulder into the wood, and to my horror, the door didn't budge because it had been bolted shut years ago to keep out the very people I was trying to avoid. I spun around, pressing my back against the rough concrete, and swung the tire iron with every bit of desperate strength I had left. The metal bar connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud, sending a jolt of pain up my arm and causing him to stumble back into the moonlight. He let out a snarl of rage rather than pain, and I saw the glint of a long hunting knife in his hand, the blade catching the pale light like a sliver of ice. I didn't give him a chance to recover, but instead, I kicked out at his knees and scrambled toward the side of the building where a narrow crawl space led under the foundation. I didn't care about spiders or snakes. I only cared about the man with the knife who was currently cursing my name and lunging for my ankles. I slid into the dark, cramped space, the smell of dirt and decay filling my nose as I pulled my legs in just as his blade hissed through the air where my calf had been a second before. He started pacing around the building, stabbing the knife into the gaps of the concrete and screaming at me to come out and face him like a man. I stayed as still as a stone, my heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it through the floorboards, and I waited for any opportunity to escape this concrete tomb. I noticed a small, rusted pipe sticking out from the dirt near my hand, and I realized it was an old drainage line that led out toward the back of the rest stop where the desert began. I began to dig frantically with my bare hands, the dry earth getting under my fingernails as I cleared enough space to wiggle my body through the narrow trench. I could hear him climbing onto the roof of the shack, trying to find a way in from above, and I knew this was my only window of time to get back to my car. I squeezed through the gap and emerged into the cool night air behind the building, the desert floor feeling like a soft carpet under my shaking hands. I didn't look back, but stayed low to the ground, crawling through the sagebrush and the shadows until I was parallel with the silver sedan. I saw that he had left his keys in the ignition with the door open, his confidence being his only mistake in an otherwise perfect plan. I didn't take his car, but instead, I reached inside and grabbed his heavy keychain, ripping it out and throwing the keys as far as I could into the dark, prickly brush of the Mojave. I heard him scream from the top of the shack as he saw me, but it was too late because I was already sprinting back to my own car with the last of my adrenaline. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it just as he reached the window. His face pressed against the glass like a demon from a nightmare. I twisted my key, the engine sputtered for a terrifying second, and then finally roared to life, the last few drops of gasoline giving me the power I needed to escape. I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning in the gravel before finding traction on the asphalt of the highway, and I left him standing there in the middle of the road, a fading figure in a silver car that would never start again. I drove for 20 miles on fumes until I saw the lights of a truck stop, and I didn't stop shaking until the sun came up and the desert didn't look so empty anymore. I never look at mismatched headlights the same way, because I know that sometimes a shadow follows you for a reason, and it doesn't always want what you have in your pockets.